Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As you well know by now, we bring to you the latest, greatest, and probably the oldest, worst, and everything in between. We look at ideas and theories and propositions and assumptions and presumptions and you name it, trying to sort out, I shouldn't say try because we do sort out pretty well, what's going on in the world of health and medicine and alternative medicine and, that whole big old package. Now, some of the things that I bring up, probably many of you know and say, ho-hum, what's new? But hopefully, even if you've heard it before, we can put a different twist on it and maybe introduce you to some ideas and or reference material that can be of help in getting a good hold on not only your health, but dispelling a lot of the garbage that's out. And there, unfortunately, is a lot of garbage, and it's not all within regular medicine. There's a lot of garbage within natural medicine. I found out a long time ago, any field that there is public interest in, there are exploiters who will come and try to exploit it and make a lot of money out of the ignorance of the people. Not that everybody's ignorant, but they're ignorant of the fact that there are charlatans, unfortunately, in natural medicine. And so I don't care for them either. Some of them come and go, and they set up an operation and make a pile of wild claims, sell a piece of junk at an exorbitant price, and when they've made a pile of money before they get tapped on the shoulder, they fold up and disappear and reappear down the road under a different name and different product, or maybe the same product with a different name, and they continue their trek. I found out a long time ago, I knew a biochemist, he's still alive, who worked with the a big research laboratory that was looking at the quality of nutritional products. And so basically it was Linus Pauling Institute. They had a lab, and what they would do is go out and buy products off the shelf and take them in and see if they had in them what they said they did. Now, we're talking about nutritional products, so you don't find medicine doing that too much, but there are people within the natural field that want to be making available things that are what they say they are. As I say, there's charlatans, unfortunately, within that field also. I mean, people is people, and there's crooks, and crooks will grab any opportunity, wherever it is, to make a buck off of the unsuspecting people. So anyhow, they picked up these products. One in particular at the time was vitamin E. And, of course, there's so much misunderstanding about E that it's ridiculous. The government allows you to call it vitamin E if it only has one fraction of the four major types of E, the alpha, beta, gamma, and delta forms. And so if you have D tocopherol, you can call it vitamin E. Okay, so there is one on the market called DL, which is a synthetic form of vitamin E, which is the absolute worst, bottom of the barrel. And doesn't give you the benefits of vitamin E. Well, anyhow, companies, including pharmaceuticals, pump out synthetic vitamin E and are allowed to call it E, and they can tell it about what E does in the body, even though what they have available is not what the testing was done with. In fact, the original studies on E were done by two Dr. Schutz out of Canada, and that's when it got out into the marketplace that there were benefits from taking vitamin E. Well, anyhow, they used a complex of vitamin E, the full complex, and it was not synthetic. And so other companies were allowed to come along and play on the fact that vitamin E, this is vitamin E, but then medicine got into the picture, and they did some studies, and they said, well, the vitamin E is not effective. They didn't know what they were talking about. However, the vitamin E they used for the study was D-L-tocopherol, which was synthetic junk E. Only one fraction of the 4 portions of it. So it's just ridiculous stuff that gets out, and people hear E, and it says E on the bottle, they think it's fine. Well, anyhow, getting back to the story, the gentleman I know, the biochemist, went out and bought a bottle from one of the major discount companies that have it on the shelves. You know, these are chains that are around the country. And so they took it back to the lab, and it said on the label 400 international units of D-L-tocopherol, which is, as I say, synthetic vitamin E. Okay, so 400 international units per capsule. And so you look, these little pearl capsules, they're like a gelatin bead with this oil inside, and of course vitamin E in its natural form is an oil, or at least that's the way it's made available, is in an oil form. So they actually ran a test in the laboratory, and basically what they found was that there was approximately 4 units of actual synthetic vitamin E, D-L-tocopherol, put on in a product which said 400 units, and the rest of it was cheap vegetable oil. So you can imagine that the public who bought this product and took it said, "Didn't do anything for me," because it wasn't even E. It was a cheap synthetic form of 1 fraction of E and a bunch of cheap vegetable oil. But they were selling it for like $3.99, $4.99, and saying what a bargain it was, and it wasn't even worth a quarter or 50 cents. And a good bottle of mixed tocopherols, unesterified, I know how it's manufactured. And it's manufactured in a big vat, and when it separates out, it separates in layers, like milk and, cream and milk and so forth, how that'll separate. Well, at the end of the process, that's how it separates off. The cream, the top one, the one that is really the complete vitamin E, is called unesterified mixed tocopherols. Has all 4 fractions in it. It's the cream of the crop. Okay? When I handle it in my office, I handle the unesterified E, cream of the crop. I had to sell 100 caps of that for $22 to $25, in that range. Maybe it's more now. I haven't paid attention to the prices. Okay, so now people say, well, gee, I can go to so-and-so and buy it for $4.99, vitamin E. No, they're not buying vitamin E. They're buying vegetable oil with a few drops of D-L-tocopherol, which is synthetic, not even E. Now, is the price for $4.99 or whatever it is that a bargain? No, it's a way overcharge for a few drops of vegetable oil, because that's what they're getting. So at any rate, things are always anymore, you have to have a basic education to understand what you're getting, or you're going to get taken, because there is a lot going on out there. I hate to say it and admit it, that there's unfortunately unscrupulous people gotten into the natural area too. But anyhow, the pharmaceuticals took the junkie, ran the study and said, no effect. The work that these guys did for years was no good. Vitamin E isn't going to help. It's not going to help your heart. It's not going to help your circulation. It's not going to help your utilization of oxygen and so forth. That they found out they must have made a mistake. And besides, a bunch of Canadians, what do they know anyhow? And that's kind of the way it's dealt with. So in the meantime, though, guess what? They're still pumping out the junk D-L-tocopherol and calling it vitamin E. So I'm only telling you that to say that, unfortunately, there's a lot of deceptive information out. And people kind of miss that part of it. And, you know, the basic average person is a decent, upright person, and they, as a rule, will give you straightforward information if they have it. And so they assume that here are these high-level people, researchers, blah, 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 scientific people, they wouldn't lie to you. Well, I hate to tell you and burst your bubble, but they do and will, especially if they can make high profit out of it. And I don't care who it is, you have to pay attention. So, I'm saying all that to say that we have these blinders because we just assume that somebody from the scientific community would give you objective information. You know, objective meaning this is the way it is. It's not how I think it is, but this is the way it is, because we have done studies that prove that to be that way. And that's true science, of course. True science says you don't assume anything. You go in with open eyes and open ears, and you start gathering information. You don't filter the information if you're capable of not filtering, but unfortunately most people have, to some degree, a lot of filters that filter out or distort or generalize. So if you go out with the assumption that vitamins are worthless, period, then any study you do is probably likely going to prove that vitamins are worthless. Now that's a joke to say that, because guess what? Why do we eat food? We eat food to get protein, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals. The body needs those to work properly. Now, I mean, what kind of nonsense is that? You don't need vitamins. Of course you need vitamins. Now, if it's missing in the food, then where do you get them? They don't come out of nowhere. You've got to get them somewhere. So if we sell garbage food, because we've talked about that, the poor quality of the food, if we sell that, then guess what? If it's not there, you don't get it. And if your body needs it to work properly, you're in big trouble. Excuse me. Many years ago, they found out that certain B vitamins and vitamin C, if they were missing out of a person's diet, their body started to bring on symptoms, some very bizarre symptoms. And especially depending on at what time in your growth and development those were missing could distort your whole structure. So, of course, the vitamins are necessary. You have to have vitamins. Now, a lot of the researchers found out early, back in the 20s and 30s, that we were buying food that was devitalized, had no nutrients in it, coming from depleted soil, and then adulterated on top of it. And even though we thought we had an agency that was going to protect the public, it became distorted along the way, because in the final picture, whoever has the chips, you know, we always talk about Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will at the most inopportune or inconvenient time. But he had another one I thought was really good, is Murphy's Golden Rule. That is, he who has the gold makes the rule. And so the big money was able to get their way and sell the public a lot of garbage and make a lot of money, and at the same time convince people it was good for them. And we won't get into all that at this point, but I'm only bringing all this up because it gets back to this idea of this blindness that we have and this assumptions that we have, because we're brought up thinking a certain thing. Well, doctors are very well trained. They know everything about the body. They know everything about diseases. They're able to find any problem. They're able to come up with a solution, and they're great people. And of course, most of them are great people, but unfortunately, there's a lot of bad information. And so, every assumption carries with it a lot of implications. And we talked already about Wilhelm Reich and a lot of the things that he found out. He came to a point in his life, he said, I'm not assuming anything anymore. I was taught this, but I'm going to go back and recheck it myself. And I'm going to set up a set of conditions that preclude there being different influences or outside influences, and he did. And for that he was amply rewarded. He ended up dying in prison, and his work kind of pushed aside, except for a few of the people who studied with him or studied his works and knew what a brilliant man he was, way ahead of his time. You know, personality-wise, he probably was maybe a bit on the abrasive side, but he knew and was a thinker, and he had shed a lot of his prejudices in doing what he did. And then we talked about the brain. You know, you go in with certain assumptions. One person comes out along the way in a new area of investigation, and they start a certain approach. Hardly ever, until maybe way down the road, if at all, do people question any of the basic assumptions. You know, because they think, wow, gee, these guys were very intelligent people, so, well, if that's what they said, then that should be right. And so we're going to assume that they are right, but they don't say we're going to assume, they're going to accept that they were right. And therefore we're going to, if they said that was worthless, then it must be worthless, so we don't want to waste our time with that. But see, that's what I said. Reich didn't do that. He said, wait a minute, I'm going to redo these assumptions and find out if it's true. And what, of course, he found out was it wasn't true. And so the same thing is true with where we are now. We talked about the glial cells in the brain, of course, as not being useful other than supportive and so forth, or protective. And here 90% of the brain didn't get studied for years because everybody assumed, whatever the first assumption was, that they didn't function like the neurons, so therefore they were only supportive and structurally and nutrient-wise and so forth, but they didn't do much for brain function. But somewhere along the way there were some big shocks, like with Einstein's brain I mentioned. You know, when they took his brain out, that I guess what they expected to find was this massive brain of this brilliant man. And of course, the first thing they found out, it was actually a little smaller than the average person. So right away they go, well, I guess it doesn't have to do with brain volume. Okay, so then they started doing some deeper studies, and the only difference, other than that it was smaller than the average, the only difference they found was a massive amount of glial cells. Now, if the glial cells had nothing to do with intelligence and thinking and processing information and so forth, then why did he have so many more, like 10 times more than the average person, or maybe more? It was a massive amount more, if they aren't important. And otherwise, the rest of the brain, there wasn't much difference. Okay, so now all of a sudden somebody says, now wait a minute, maybe we should look into these glial cells. And so now they found out all kinds of stuff. As I said, there's a book written called The Second Brain, and I mentioned about some of the other stuff in the last broadcast about some of the things that were found out, that the glial cells have neurotransmitters, they carry information, process information. I mean, at this point, it's starting over to understand the brain, because only 10% of it was neurons, which they felt was the real brain, and this other stuff was just peripheral. You know, they did the same thing with DNA. They had DNA, and they found this water clustered around the DNA molecules, and they said, well, that stupid water's in the way, and we want to study the DNA. So they got rid of the water, and then they tried to study the DNA. Well, later they found out that that clustered water around the DNA was extremely important in the function of the DNA. So the thing about being blind is if you go in with certain assumptions, it does not allow you to start like a little kid and look at everything, because you don't know anything about anything. You got to learn about everything. But as time goes on, these prejudices become more and more active, until pretty soon we've got this little narrow tunnel of the way we see the world. Okay, so the same thing happened with the quote germ theory of disease. Now, we've hit on that on and off, but I just want to take it a step further. You know, Pasteur, there's a lot of material out there. If you dig it up on your own, don't take my word for it, you'll find out that he was somewhat less than honest. Let's put it that way. I think he wanted to make a name, and I think he wanted to make a lot of money. That's what I can derive from what I've been able to dig up about him, which doesn't necessarily make him bad. It's how he uses the information, if he's using it in an honest or dishonest way. If you're using it in a dishonest way or distorting the information to make money and get a name, then that's blatantly dishonest. On the other hand, if you just make a mistake, which everybody does, and you assume things that aren't true, that's something different. So at any rate, I'm convinced, and from everything I can find, that here's a guy who knew something about science. He was a chemist, but he was not a medical person, and he definitely was not a medical researcher. And so he was not innovative enough, in my mind, because there's two people. There's people who have innovative, creative ideas, and then there's other people who are developers and utilizers and take a lot of other people's material honestly and sometimes dishonestly, and they can utilize it and merchandise it and make it profitable. So in the case of Pasteur, I'm sure from everything I can find out, and I'm not saying it couldn't be otherwise, but I'm pretty sure when you read all the material that's been put out, it appears that, as I say, he wanted to merchandise, and so he didn't even arrive at the idea of vaccinations. He got it from Jenner, who got it from some other places, but for all practical purposes, everybody really thinks that he's the man, Pasteur. And of course they named the Pasteur Institute in France after Pasteur. They wanted to claim him because everybody thought he was a great guy. And so he came up with this very simple theory: germs cause disease, called the germ theory of disease. It still is called the germ theory of disease, which says it never has been absolutely proven, but everybody assumes it has, so nobody questions it. So as long as nobody raises questions, we'll just go on with the assumption that that's the case. But it goes deeper than that, and the researcher who was medically trained in medicine, pharmacy, research, chemistry, you name it, who was a real student and researcher, was Dr. Antoine Béchamp. He was also in France. Pasteur knew of what he was doing. Pasteur borrowed some of his material. Pasteur misinterpreted, and I have to think deliberately when you read what happened, to create this germ theory of disease, which was easy to sell to the public, because everybody back then was saying, why are we sick? What's wrong? What's going on? Well, a guy by the name of Leeuwenhoek, which I think was Dutch, was the first guy to develop a type of microscope, and so then they were able to look and see that there's these little microscopic one-celled organisms that are living and taking in nutrients and giving off byproducts called bacterial forms. And so it's so vast that we can't even do it justice in what we're doing now, other than to tweak your interest and get you looking into it. I would suggest you get the book that was the summation of Béchamp's work, called Blood and Its Third Anatomical Element. It's on the list in my website. And Antoine Béchamp summarized what he found out, and he found out these little living organisms called microzyma that were pleomorphic. Now, pleomorphic means many forms. Okay, so what he found out, that the environment or terrain determined the shape, form, and function of these forms. Okay, now Pasteur came up with something called monomorphism, saying each form is a different species. And so it's these different forms, if you get them in your body, they attack you, and we have to give you something to kill them out, or we have to immunize, or actually vaccinate for, because it doesn't work that way. We have to vaccinate you for prevention of these things causing you a problem. Okay, so it's interesting the way the whole thing went, and it took off because it was easy to sell, The doctors loved it because they said, okay, germs are doing it, we're going to give something to kill the germs, you're going to be well. Now, placebo alone ought to have done a lot. But nonetheless, on this basic assumption, the whole germ theory developed and has been carried on, even though over the years, contrary information has come up differently. Now, I mentioned that there's a book, and I'm going to make it available as a download, called Bacteria Incorporated, and this was written way back in copyright 1949. And in that, they quote all these studies, and one was at the Mayo Clinic on pleomorphism, how the change of environment causes a form to change to conform to the environment. Now, there's on and off people around the world who for years have been aware of this and talked about it, but nobody paid any attention much because everybody knew that germs cause disease. The medical schools were teaching the doctors that germs cause disease, and so that's the story. Now, there's a lot of implications about this, and one has to do with the bowel. You know, the bowel has a certain healthy terrain that it should have if you're eating a good diet. You're not putting a lot of garbage junk and not taking too many antibiotics that really disrupt the whole environment. You grow a type of bacteria that is synergistic with the body. And that bacteria produces, off of the byproducts of metabolism, certain vitamin factors and hormone, well, like amino acid tryptophan, for example, is made. And the bowel tract. So there's a lot of things made there by the good, what we call good bacteria, friendly bacteria, in a healthy bowel tract. Now, if you mess up that terrain, guess what? Those good bacterial forms morph into different forms. And the different forms no longer make the things you need, but in fact produce toxic substances that poison the body. Things like indole, skatol, which are organic poisons, phenol, which has very strongly been implicated with breast cancer, hydrogen sulfide, which has the capability of shutting down the respiratory chain in the body and hence being fatal. And a lot of other organic toxins are produced, not that they're attacking you, but the metabolism of this different form is different. Because remember, bacterial forms are one-celled living organisms who take in nutrients, give off byproducts, and reproduce. And they want to live because they are a one-celled living organism. So what they do is, if they are forced to change their chemistry, their genetic, and their shape to adapt to a poisonous environment so they can survive, then the alteration of their chemistry sometimes produces byproducts that are toxic to our body because they're not supposed to be living there in that condition. And so that's where pleomorphism could be a bad problem. And of course, the interesting thing is, if you take a bunch of probiotics and think that's going to correct your bowel without getting to the basic problem, guess what? If the original good, so-called good bacteria morphed into toxin-producing bacterial forms, what's going to happen with putting more of that in there? You're going to produce more of the toxic forms. So that isn't solving the problem. It's got to go deeper than that. So that's one application of it. Okay, so I'm telling you that there is such a thing as pleomorphism. I'm absolutely convinced. I've watched it in the dark field microscope, which is basically, you can see it in the human blood because these forms are everywhere. Antoine Béchamp found them in the soil, found them everywhere, and they actually participate with the body as synergists. And as you get down and get your body sicker and more poison, the forms change into different forms to try to consume those poisons to keep them alive, which in process helps keep us alive. But there comes a point when the body finally dies, and when it does, they morph into a fungal form, which then breaks down the body and takes it back to the dust. So it gets back to what nature does with bacteria, is that's part of the cleanup crew to keep the body clean. So, It's interesting, I just ran across a study that was done in 2002 in Canada. It says, are there naturally occurring pleomorphic bacteria in the blood of healthy humans? Now, of course, their definition of a healthy human is someone who's not currently being diagnosed with some set of symptoms that's called a disease. They may or may not be healthy. But anyhow, they have, at the conclusion is, they have photographs, they have biochemistry, they have everything to prove, and their conclusion is yes, these bacterial forms live in healthy people. They do change their form. They can be found inside of red blood cells, and I'm guessing these are sick red blood cells, and they're consuming it. And I know, without taking the time to get into all this, that they actually can alter and have a lot to do with genetics in the body too. So, Antoine Béchamp, I think you should get his book if you're really interested, and I would get some of the books on Pasteur. There's some that give you deeper insight, and of course there's bound to be a few that says, why, Pasteur was a great man in medicine, by people who have never bothered to look at the whole realm. You will find it interesting if you really dig into some of the findings, because when you get on the internet and you start searching, if you learn how to search for all this stuff, you can find all kinds of things. People ask questions, pleomorphism of microorganisms and theories of infectious disease. Here's a big study. This came out of regular research. Bacteria in the intestine, helpful residents or enemies from within? And the answer is yes, both. If a bad environment of the bowel creates a different form of bacteria, it's not that they're attacking you, but they're producing something different. And this one that was in Canada, as I say, was done really good. And their answer was yes, and they showed some microphotographs of it. They were able to separate it out. They were able to verify by biochemistry and genetics that these were in fact bacterial forms. So I'm saying all that to say we work on a presumption that the bacteria attack us, which they don't. They're there as part of the cleanup and all the way to death and consuming the body, and then we pump all the antibiotics in to stop the immune response and to kill off the bacteria, and actually can create more forms. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in understanding, and us understanding how freely we want to run and get antibiotics, because we think we're doing ourselves a service by killing the bugs in our body, which are part of the whole process of nature. Now remember, everything in nature gets cleaned up one way or the other. Buzzards, vultures, ants, flies and maggots, all these different bacterial forms, they all perform the process of cleaning up nature and restoring things back to where they should be. So why do we want to kill them all? In fact, the more we kill them, the sicker people get. So it just, again, has to do with this idea we have this preconceived blind spot, and therefore, once we assume, then we miss the bigger picture and we get all focused on one thing. Oh, these bacteria are bad and they're causing all this. We don't have time to get into all the final details that we could and should, because this could be like a 2 or 3 day program just on the whole thing of pleomorphism and bacterial forms. What I want to do, of course, again, is to challenge you to look into it and see the implications of what it does when you take a pile of antibiotics and you kill off a lot of stuff. There's ways of helping the body keep clean and correct and not have to kill bugs. There's only a few rare, unusual occasions. If you ingested a pile of manure full of different organisms and your body was overwhelmed and sick and couldn't handle it, I guess maybe there might be a case in your life, or maybe 2 at the most, where maybe some antibiotics would be useful. But taking tons of them every year for every little sniffle and snort and a cold, flu, or whatever is not only not enhancing your health, it's adding to the problem of creating unusual forms that no longer are in cooperation with your body. So I want you to keep that in mind, and as I say, I'm going to put that Bacteria Incorporated onto the website that you can download it as a free download and get some ideas about it to get your thinking. So anyhow, it was nice being with you again. We've run out of time as usual, and I can't wait to get back with something new. I've got something interesting that I think you'll find intriguing for the next broadcast. But in the meantime, Tune in to mindyourhealthcast.com broadcast and website, and we will be with you again. In the meantime, be healthy.